Hello everybody, welcome back. We are doing another Kindle sample. The big list has given me another book. I'm here to share it with you, tell you what I think. And the big old list this time gave me this one. The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. Now, I realize that this may seem a little unusual. If you followed me from the beginning, which, thank you, subscribe. But if you followed me from the beginning, you know that a lot of the works that I tend to talk about and look at and read tends to be, number one, fiction. Number two, sort of in the sci-fi, fantasy, grazing the very edge of horror sort of genres, right? This is decidedly nonfiction. This is political and historical. However, I always believe that no reader should be I think it is best to have a broad variety of interest. I think that's a really good idea. I don't think it's good for a reader to spend their reading career being just one thing. I mean, I totally get going down a rabbit hole of Stephen King or Terry Pratchett or spending a while just reading some science fiction and then switching to fantasy. I absolutely understand. You find a groove and you get into the groove, and that's real good. But I think when the opportunity presents itself, I think it's a very, very good idea to switch things up, go into something that is not your usual, just to see what you can pull for, just to see what you can get. So what I picked up was The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is not a recent book. It was written in 1951. It was then revised a bunch of times. But it keeps kind of popping up these days. I wonder why. But from the cover, it is very... I like the cover design. I don't think it's the original cover design of the book. I don't know what that cover design is, actually. But it kind of tells a lot. It's red, white, and black. That's very, and very spiky, right? So it is it's got a lovely, very symmetrical design. I'm a big fan of symmetry, but it's definitely trying to evoke that sort of World War II-ish imagery that we've got going. And the title tells me kind of exactly what to expect. The Origins of Totalitarianism. Where does it come from? Why is it here? So... yeah, let's dive in, shall we? Let's see what Ms. Arendt has to say about the origins of totalitarianism. It's not an easy title to get out smoothly, as you can tell. Let me give it a read, and I'll get right back to you, all right? Hang in there. Whoa. Okay, all right, hold on. Let me get myself together again. All right. This was a lot. This sample is a lot. If you've been following along, you'll notice that I'm used to reading these kind of short samples about ladies with snakes and murder bots and demons and things like that. I'm kind of used to the narrative voice of fiction, which is very different from the narrative voice of academic history. It's a lurch, let me tell you that. If you're going to be switching gears like this is switching gears real hard. Because once you get used to a certain way of telling a story, and this is telling a story. I mean, that's what history does, is tell stories. But once you're used to a certain way of telling a story, when it changes, you kind of have to take a step back. You have to be prepared for that. This book is incredibly academic. It is the type of book you would probably read in like a history class, right? I don't think it's the kind of book you would pick up because you want a pleasant light reading, right? With a title like The Origins of Totalitarianism, I'm not surprised. But that's really what struck me as I was reading this sample. And what also struck me was the very beginning of it, where Ms. Arendt basically starts the book with the expectation that World War III is going to happen. She says, this book has been written against a background of both reckless optimism and reckless despair. She kind of expects, and I think I don't remember which year the final version of this book was, but that's kind of where it begins, is she's realizing that the world that we live in has the possibility of succumbing to totalitarianism at any time, but also has the possibility of resisting totalitarianism when it shows up. And she kind of, at least from the prefaces of the book that are in here, it seems like she doesn't really know which way things will go. She doesn't really know how that particular coin is going to land. So all she can really do is try to figure out where it comes from, how it starts, what its roots are. And she's writing this, the first edition she's writing just after World War II, right? She's published it in 51. So you have a good sense that she's probably started writing it several years prior to that. And she's really trying to understand, I think, in the face of what we saw in World War II, what we saw with Nazi Germany and the Holocaust and all that, she's asking herself the same thing what we would all ask ourselves, which is, how did this happen? Right? And she's still got Stalin still going on at that time. So yeah, how did all this happen? How did we get these totalitarian regimes that seem so really antithetical to good human life? And so that's what this book seems to be, is that exploration, saying, let's figure this out and try to figure out where totalitarianism comes from, hopefully in the hopes that, maybe we can figure out how to cut it off if we see it starting up again, right? I mean, that's what a lot of history is supposed to be. It's supposed to show us the mistakes of the past so that we can identify them when they show up again. But, I don't remember who said it, but there was this one quote that I really like, which is that if there's one thing we can learn from history, it's that we never learn from history. So we shall see. But anyway, the book begins with several prefaces to later editions, right? So as far as I can tell, this is the complete version of The Origins of Totalitarianism. The first preface starts with an interesting examination of sort of the distinction between anti-Semitism and like religious Jew hatred, and trying to make a distinction between those two things. The second one is really interesting. It's about imperialism and the idea that foreign aid is the same thing as, essentially the same thing, as foreign domination, right? If you give aid to a country, then you are in control of how it behaves and how it acts and what choices it's going to make. And so that is foreign aid, as benevolent as it can be, is a way of imposing one country's will over another country's will. And she says that one of the things that makes one of the sort of central concepts of totalitarianism is the idea of world politics, of sort of, as the name implies, total control over world politics. And a totalitarian regime is going to try to impose its will on other nations, as we have seen. She says the third preface is Totalitarianism, which basically, that preface is mostly about the revisions that she made from the first publication to the last. And one of the interesting things that she notes is that totalitarianism is not a one-size-fits-all thing. She notes that German totalitarianism is different from Russian totalitarianism, which is different from Chinese totalitarianism, right? It's got different flavors to it, but fundamentally it's the same idea. Total control over everything. And then she starts to get into, with all of the prefaces finished and done, she starts to get into what the title promises, which is the origins of totalitarianism. And she chooses, not surprisingly, because World War II is just finished, to start with anti-Semitism. And that is this trying to track the sort of what were the political and social changes in Europe that gave rise to anti-Semitism. And it's a long track. She talks about how Jewish people in Europe for a very long time were essentially a stateless people, that they lived in these various European countries. They did not have a state of their own. And they were able to make themselves useful to different leaders and become sort of important parts of the state without being of that state. Does that make any sense? I hope so, because it didn't really make a lot of sense to me. I had some trouble in certain points, I'm not going to lie. But then as these states changed, as sort of what people needed from governments changed, what tended to happen is that the Jews of Europe became kind of stand-ins for the governments that the people did not like, right? The people were able to say, we don't like the government, we don't like what the government's doing, and we're going to put that on these people who are not really us, but who work very closely with the government and who work closely with the banks and the leaders and the kings and the queens. And we're going to put this on them, right? They are fundamentally outsiders to us, even if their families lived here for generations, but it doesn't matter. They're not really our people, that kind of thing. And so as European governments changed, blaming problems on, it became an easier way to blame problems on the Jews than it was to blame problems on the state. And so we have this sort of slow ramping up, and you start to have people who rather than making this connection obliquely or sort of subtly, start to make it much more directly and obviously. And that's kind of where anti-Semitism starts to ramp up as we get towards the end of the 19th century. That's about as far as I was able to get in the sample. It's a longish sample. It is incredibly detailed. Like I said at the beginning of this is a history book. If you're going to read it, and I think you should, I really do think you should. Am I going to read it? I hope so. I would like to someday, but I need to get myself in the right mind frame for it, because it's not, I don't know, I've read other history books, and maybe to my own detriment, I've read popular history, right, which is designed for people who are not deeply invested in sort of the standards of historical research and the standards of historical writing that maybe a professional historian would be invested in. This book is clearly for somebody who really wants to get their hands dirty in the idea of totalitarianism and where it comes from, and she is assuming that we, the readers, are as invested in and as intelligent as she is. And so if you're not ready for that, then you're going to do what I do, which is occasionally I'd be sitting there reading it, and then my eyes would close, and then I go, oh, I'm reading at work, that's not good. So I would really like to read this whole book. I think I would need to maybe find some baby steps between where I am and where Hannah Arendt is, because I think she's difficult. I'm not saying I don't recommend the book. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that you gotta know what you're getting into, is what I'm saying. Now, if you've read this book and you want to say that I am being a base coward in not really diving into it, you are free to do so. I acknowledge that. I feel this is a personal failure on my part. But nevertheless, I think it looks really good. It is extraordinarily thorough. I'm very interested to see where else she goes with this idea and sort of what angles she examines totalitarianism from. Like I said, she said very clearly in one of the prefaces that Russia is not China, is not Germany. So I'm interested if she does examine other totalitarianisms to see what is shared between them, what is common amongst these different ones, because you didn't see a lot of this. They don't have all the same qualities. And so what is the common quality of these governments? And I know she says at one point, she says, no matter how much we may be capable of learning from the past, it will not enable us to know the future, which is a good line. But nevertheless, I do kind of hope that maybe towards the end of this book, she sort of is able to tell us what to look out for, right? What to watch for. If you start to see this sort of thing, then something must be done. And I know other people who have written about totalitarianism and fascism have looked at a lot of current politics in several current countries and have said something needs to be done. So I think that Hannah Arendt is a voice in that choir, but she's a voice that's maybe a little bit difficult for amateurs to, like myself, to really get into. So I think it's probably a very important book to read. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to read the whole thing. We shall see. But if you've read it and you want to chime in and tell me what I'm missing, please, please, please do so. I would love to find out. And if you want to call me a coward, go ahead. I don't care. So thank you all for sticking around. I hope that the great big random list gives me something a little more lighthearted and readable next time. We shall see. But until then, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.